On Wednesday and Friday nights, I play Frisbee up in Nanaimo. And I love Frisbee. I've been playing Ultimate Frisbee for about 5 years. And if you don't know what Ultimate Frisbee is, imagine football without the contact and 20 times as fast. Okay, so it's this really energetic sport. And I love it. And I'm not very good at it, but I enjoy playing. I love the exercise. I love getting out. And even in Nanaimo, when it's 12 degrees and raining, I'm just like a duck to water. I'm so happy playing Frisbee. So this Wednesday, we were playing Frisbee, and the teams were fairly evenly matched. I was quite enjoying the game. And as in most sports, a rivalry, kind of, like a fun rivalry got going. And there was two guys, especially, who were at the center of this rivalry. We'll call the one Brad. And so Brad would be about my height, and is has a really good sense of the field. He knows where people are and should be and where to throw, and he's a really good Frisbee player. And then there's the other guy, and we'll call him Dan. Now, Dan was about 5'6", but what he doesn't have in height, he makes up for in speed. Okay, so we have these two guys. One, and both of them have a great sense of Frisbee. They have a great sense of where to throw it, and they're good. They're just really good. So on one particular point, somebody throws the Frisbee into the end zone, and Dan and Brad both run for the Frisbee. But it's this kind of high, lofting throw, and it's kind of there, and it slowly starts to come down. And as it comes down, Brad and Dan both jump for it, but Brad has 6 inches on Dan, and so Brad gets the disc and scores. And in a moment, he's so caught up in the moment, he turns to Dan and he says, "What, you couldn't get it, short stuff?" Like, whoa, right? And so everyone on the team's like, oh my goodness. Very next point. Another disc is thrown. This time, it's not high and lofting. It's a bullet. It's going straight, and it's going into the back corner of the end zone. And Brad and Dan both take off for the disc. But this time, Dan has the advantage because he's way faster than Brad. And he gets it in the end zone, and Brad is probably 20 paces behind. And what happens? His whole team turns to Brad and says, "Hey, what, you couldn't get it? Tall stuff?" And so this rivalry goes on for a couple points, to the point where somebody on one of the teams had to say, "Look, this game is not a game between 3 or 4 people. This is a game between 14 people. Let's make sure everyone gets a chance to play." That spirit of Ultimate that was witnessed on Wednesday is a little bit like what we have in our scripture for today. And so before we get into it, let me just set up the story for a second. The story begins, this story happens in Matthew 23. 2 chapters earlier, in Matthew 21, Jesus has come into Jerusalem for the first time in the story. He comes into Jerusalem, and he turns over the tables in the temple. And then in chapter 22, he has this long debate with the Pharisees and the scribes. And the long debate with the Pharisees and the scribes ends with the question we talked about, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago. What is the greatest law? Jesus is asked this question. He answers the question. And the text says, the very end of Matthew 22 says, they had no more questions to ask him. The debate was over. Jesus had won the debate against the scribes and the Pharisees. And that's where the story for today comes into play. And one more thing. The scribes and the Pharisees were kind of an institution in and of themselves. They were teachers that existed between we think about 200 BCE and 100 CE. So for about 300 years, they were the chief interpreters of the Torah. Okay? So when Jesus is talking about it, he's not talking about all of Judaism. He's just talking about a small segment of the people who were teaching the ways of Torah. Does that make sense? So he's not critiquing an entire people, he's just critiquing a certain school of thought. Okay. Which is where Jesus says to his crowd and to the disciples, that's how this story begins. Now, this story, it may be good if you wanted to. There's a pew Bible in front of you, and if you wanted to open up and follow along with Matthew 23, it might allow you to see all the little pieces of the story. Because Jesus essentially begins a list of critique. He begins to critique the Pharisees and the scribes, and he has a lot of critiques of them. So if you're following along, it might give you a little bit of structure here. So we're going to go through a lot of information really quickly. Bear with me. Okay, so first, Jesus says to the crowd and his disciples, they like to sit at the seat of Moses, which is important. The seat of Moses was a way of recognizing the leadership of Moses, and to sit in that seat would have meant what? That you were like Moses. So it's bold if you want to sit in the seat of Moses. And then he says to them what? He says, do what they teach, not what they do. Which is a pretty significant critique in and of itself. If you tell your child, oh, you should only eat one dessert, it's most healthy to eat one dessert, and then you yourself go and eat 10, which is your child likely to do? Go and eat 10, if you're like me. Okay, so Jesus is saying, do what they teach. They're teaching one dessert, but don't do what they do. Then he has this strange line. He says, they tie up burdens for people to carry and don't help them move them. What does that mean? Well, each rabbi, like each minister in the United Church, for example, would have a different interpretation of the law, a different way of understanding what the law was about. And this was called a yoke. So each rabbi would have their own yoke. But sometimes the requirements under the yoke would be so difficult they would be impossible to follow. So a good example of this is university classes. University classes have this, profs tend to think, and I apologize if you're a prof, they say, you know what, for our course, you need to read 15 books. And you go, okay, that's great. But then you have 4 other classes that all want you to read 15 books. And you'll never get through that reading. It's just impossible. So that's the kind of yokes that we're talking about. Okay, the yokes were too burdensome for anyone to carry. And then there's this strange line. They say, they do all their deeds, for their phylacteries are wide and their tassels are long. What do you do with that? So, first of all, what is a phylactery? This man here is wearing a phylactery. And do you see? It's a little box on their head. And the little box on their head, you'd write the laws of Torah on that box, and you'd put it on your head. And so as you were praying, you'd literally feel the weight of the law on your head. And it was a way of recognizing that the law was also supposed to be on your heart. And their tassels, well, rabbis would have tassels on their garment that would recognize them, that would symbolize their status as a rabbi. So you kind of have this impression that they were kind of one-upping each other. Like, oh, Bob's phylactery is bigger than my phylactery. And so next time you go and make a phylactery, it would just be a little bit wider so everyone can know that you are holy. Or maybe you'd make your tassels a little bit longer. And so there's this one-upping of one another. Phylacteries are a little bit like crosses. So some people wear a cross around their neck to symbolize their faith as a way of recognizing their walk with Jesus. And yet some people go and make really expensive crosses as a symbol of, I don't know what, holiness maybe. This particular cross was selling for $1.9 million. That may be defeating the point of having a cross around your neck. Okay? They like to sit at the place of honor. So if you ever had to design a wedding seating plan, you're trying to figure out who is going to sit close to you and who's going to sit far. You're probably going to have your wedding party close to you, and then maybe your parents will be at the front table as close as they can possibly get, and then your really close friends, and then at the back corner, you're going to put like your great Aunt Mabel and your 5 cousins twice removed, who you had to invite but didn't really want to invite. Okay, so the Pharisees and the scribes, they like to sit closer. They like to be closer to the place of honor. You can also imagine that this would be kind of a game of one-upsmanship. Who can sit the closest? Ooh, I'm just a little bit closer to the place of honor than you are. And they liked, I don't know if Gyllenhaal actually likes being called out and asked to sign things. But the Pharisees liked the experience of walking through the marketplace and having people call out, Rabbi, Rabbi. So that's the list of critiques that Jesus has of the scribes and the Pharisees. They make yokes, they have wide phylacteries, they compete for the place of honor. They like going through the marketplace and having their name Rabbi called out. And it's this outdoing one another. A good example these days is weddings. Like, have you flipped through the channels? You know how many shows there are about outdoing each other in weddings? Like a whole show about having the best dress that you can possibly have, and then the best cake. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's one coming soon with the best invitation. And then there's whole shows that are devoted just to tackling the whole question of who has the best wedding. There's parents. I'll confess to this one. Someday I'd like to be a dad, and when I'm a dad, I want to be the world's #1 dad. I want to be the best dad the world has ever seen. And so I can just imagine myself, when it gets to that point in time, constantly trying to outdo my neighbor and make a better Halloween costume, organize a better treasure hunt, have the coolest birthday parties and sleepovers. Like, it would be exhausting. It will be exhausting. Businesses do this, especially with greenwashing, right? Organic, green, fair trade is the coolest, newest thing, and so they're continually trying to outdo each other, but really when you look below the surface, there's not much there. Or politicians and governments. Like, it seems to be all about the photo ops and mingling just to jockey for power. And it's just about governing and holding on to power, not about anything else. And you know what? Churches do this too. Somebody goes to a church and they say, wow, you have a Sunday school with 10 people in it? And then you go back to your home congregation and they're like, they have 10 and we only have 2. We need to get the young people in our church. Or they go, oh, you guys have a chili cook-off and raise $3,400? I think we need to start a chili cook-off. Or, your pastor is how old? We need to get a pastor who's younger. Right? It's outdoing each other. And it looks a little bit like this.
Mr. Jones and Mr. Krempler were neighbors. They each had $3,000. With his money, Mr. Jones bought himself a $3,000 car. With his money, Mr. Krempler bought himself a new refrigerator, a new range, a new washer, a new dryer, a record player, 2 new television sets, and a brand new Volkswagen. Now Mr. Jones is faced with that age-old problem, keeping up with the Kremplers.
Constantly trying to outdo each other is exhausting, and it is frustrating. Trying to always be the number one dad or grandparent, trying to always be the number one church, it's simply exhausting. And most importantly, it misses the point. Outdoing each other for the sake of outdoing each other completely misses the point. So what's the point of a wedding? The point of a wedding is to commit your life to somebody. It's to celebrate that with your friends and family. And it doesn't matter what the invitations or the cake or any of that looks like. For parents, what's the point of being a parent? Love your kid. Give a safe space for them. Nourish them. Guide them. Really, nothing else matters than those things. Businesses, to provide a product and a service that means something in the world, to provide meaningful employment, not to outdo each other for the sake of outdoing each other. For politicians in government, it's to protect the vulnerable, to make sure that people with a lot of power don't take over everything, it's to make sure that people are cared for in the same way. It's a little bit like being a parent. And churches, what's the point of having a church? To provide a safe space for people to come and worship, to provide times of meditation and teaching, to provide a base, a foundation that we can go out and change the world, not just to be better than the church down the road. That's just exhausting and frustrating. So what would Jesus say? What would Jesus say to the people who are going crazy trying to figure out their wedding plans? What would Jesus say to parents who are always trying to be the best for the sake of being the best? Or to businesses, or to politicians, or to governments? In the story for today, in verses 8, 9, and 10, Jesus says, don't worry about being called a rabbi. Your rabbi is God. Your instructor, the instructor is the Messiah, and the Messiah will be a servant who will be least among you. The least among you will be the greatest, and the greatest among you will be the least of these. The story for today is kind of obscure. It's kind of strange. We don't often see little inspirational posters posted around saying, watch out for the width of your phylactery. But what we may do is rewrite a story that might apply to us in this time and this place. So here's a shot. Then Jesus said to the people at Chemainus United Church, the Christian denominations in Canada have long held a place of honor, but do whatever they teach and follow it, but do not do as they do. For they do not always practice what they teach. They make heavy legalistic doctrine for you to follow, and they don't give good ways to live out a faithful life. They do all their deeds to be seen by newspapers and public media. They have silly bumper stickers, cheesy church signs, and what would Jesus do bracelets. They love to be seen as prominent institutions, And they compete against each other for the biggest attendance, best youth programs, and most successful chili cook-off fundraisers. And they try, and they compete for popular public opinion and the highest givings. But don't worry about all of that. What matters is how you listen for, learn about, and live the work of God in the world. The greatest among you will be a servant, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. Let's not worry about any of these things as we try to humble ourselves, not for the purpose of being exalted, but for the purpose of living out God's work in the world. Amen.